Good afternoon. A warm welcome to all of you for this month's installment of Creation Justice Webinars, the monthly program that seeks to put faith into action for the common good and for the common home that we all share. We are delighted to be with you today. I'm Brooks Barrett, the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. As always, I am joined by the Reverend Dr. Michael Malcolm, who joins us from Birmingham, Alabama, where he is the Executive Director for Alabama Interfaith Power and Light and the People's Justice Council. Michael, I'm excited about today. We're addressing an important subject. We're talking about job creation and climate action. There's some people who tell some lies out there to say those two things can't be combined, they can't go together. But we know that today the truth shall arise. It shall not be buried under our watch. And we've got three terrific panelists that we'll introduce in a second. But first, can you give us a faith framework for our conversation today?
Yeah, Brooks, thank you for your introduction and giving me an extra accreditation that I hadn't quite earned, but I'll take it nonetheless if that means I'm the doctor of cool. Allow me a moment to acknowledge the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and Cherokee First Nations whose lands I speak from. I also want to take a moment to honor my ancestors, my mentors, my colleagues, and my communities on whose shoulder I stand. In scripture, we find this phrase, and he was moved by compassion. The definition for compassion is to be sympathetic. It's to have pity and concern for the sufferings and misfortunes of others. An example of this would be that the victim should be treated with compassion. Another example of this is the theological phrase that I just gave you, which is given credited to Jesus and his actions and why he moved in the manner that he moved. He was moved by compassion. The American Jobs Plan has moments and phraseology that helps me to see this definition and to see this theological phrasing within it. It was moved by compassion in the fact that it centers those who have been under-resourced and underserved. It was moved by compassion, by allowing for 40% of the benefits to go to those who are most vulnerable. Although we do need to define what vulnerable is, we also need to define what benefits look like. Nevertheless, it centers those who are most vulnerable. It's moved by compassion. The reason why that we can get behind this as a community of faith, the reason why we as faith leaders can get behind an American Jobs Plan is because it is moved by compassion. It addresses some of the social ills. It addresses the fact that there are 67% of the most vulnerable amongst us paying almost 20% of their incomes towards their utility bills. It addresses the fact that we have a disproportionate amount of people who are now out of work because of a pandemic. It addresses the fact that we have healthcare workers who have historically been disproportionately overlooked and underserved. It addresses the things that we need because it is moved in compassion, and the things that are missing and the things that need further shaping are where our hands and hearts come in. There was a priest who was having a service, and all of a sudden he turned the lights off and he shined a light on an image of the crucifixion of Jesus the Christ. And that was Jesus whose arms were stretched out and who was nailed to a cross. And he stood there saying nothing, and nothing was being done and as far as the actions were concerned. And what the priest told the congregation at that time was, we are the hands and we are the voice and we are the feet of Christ, and we are to move. And so getting behind this plan and helping us to move helping to move this plan is our call. It is our duty because we are to be moved by compassion. Thank you for your time, and I truly look forward to hearing from my guests. I told you all earlier, and I tell everybody who's listening now, this is my community. I'm not gonna act like I don't know these folks. I'm gonna act like I talk to them more often than not. And so I'm gonna dispense with all niceties, and we just gonna have some good old country conversation because that's who I be. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Michael. I appreciate the country conversation, but I also, at the same time, realize you just demonstrated why you are a Reverend Doctor in the eyes of myself, at least. You are a doctor of theology for the people and the planet. So I'm hereby giving you that degree. But I am now honored to introduce our three panelists for today in the order that they'll be speaking. First up, we have with us Natalie Mebane. She is the United States Policy Director at 350.org, where she works to influence the federal government to phase out fossil fuels and to advocate for a just transition to an economy run 100% clean and renewable energy. Additionally, she currently serves on the boards of Young Voices for the Planet, the Student Conservation Association, and Care About Climate. She is the adult mentor for the International Youth Climate Organization's Zero Hour, helping to lead their policy and finance teams. For 4 years, she worked for the National Sierra Club in advocating against the expansion of oil, gas, and pipelines, while also working to protect public lands. Natalie will be followed by Bracken Hendricks, who is the CEO and founder of Urban Ingenuity, which works to provide financing for projects such as solar development and microgrids, while maintaining a special focus on reaching underserved communities. From the book he co-authored with Governor Jay Inslee entitled Apollo's Fire, Igniting America's Clean Energy Economy, to his role as a longtime advisor to former President Bill Clinton and the Clinton Foundation, he has long been a leading figure in policy discussions pertaining to clean energy and the economy. He has put his knowledge and talent to work in founding organizations such as Apollo Alliance and most recently Evergreen Action. And then rounding it out for us today, bringing it home, is the Reverend Dr. Ambrose Carroll, Senior Pastor of the Church by the Side of the Road in Berkeley, California. He is the founder and CEO of Green the Church, which works at the intersection of Black churches and the climate justice movement through trainings, workshops, and as I can attest, some of the best climate summits ever. His work and his insights have been featured in many media outlets, including CNN, NBC News, Christianity Today, Inside Climate News, and the Yale Climate Connections. He additionally serves as on the steering committee for the California Interfaith Power and Light. We are grateful to have each one of you with us today. Natalie, if you could get us started.
Definitely. Thank you so much for the great introduction. I'm definitely happy to be here. So I'm Natalie Mebane. I'm the United States Policy Director at 350.org, International Climate Organization. And I focus, of course, on just overall United States policy, passing legislation, stopping legislation that we oppose, as well as working with the administration to, put their goals into action. In terms of the, going over the American Jobs Plan, going over essentially Biden's full infrastructure plan, there's a lot in there. We haven't seen yet the official bill created yet. It's still going to be, it's still being worked on. But even from the very in-depth fact sheet that was shared back in March and April, we can see it's a very ambitious plan, spending over $2 trillion over the next 10 years, and really making investments that we should have made a long time ago, really maintaining infrastructure and rebuilding places that have been neglected for many years. I think for 350.org's perspective, our biggest interest in it, of course, is the fact that we are working to transition off of fossil fuels. And that's not going to just happen without actual effort, without actual investment, without it being intentional. And so there are some great things about the plan that we're pushing for. And there are some things in the plan that we would also like to change. There's some emphasis related to carbon capture sequestration, or there's also some focuses within the plan on terms of building new nuclear plants. And for 350.org, our position overall is that we want 100% clean, safe, and sustainable energy. And so anything that doesn't meet that threshold, we are not pushing for. So we are mostly pushing, of course, for any renewable energy provisions, as well as also, I think a part for me that stood out that I really like is the lead pipe retrofit of replacing lead pipes across America. That is a problem that we've essentially ignored for a very long time in this country that affects communities, mostly Black and Brown communities everywhere. And so I think that it's good that it doesn't just hold infrastructure pieces, traditional infrastructure pieces, but it also emphasizes public health. And so that's some of the few things that we're really interested in pursuing, and really getting our transportation system off of being gas powered as well is something I'm really excited about.
All right, thank you, Natalie, for giving us that helpful introduction and overview of what is coming before us in terms of policy. We'll now turn things over to Bracken Hendricks.
Great. Yeah, it's really a wonderful conversation. Want to thank Reverend Malcolm for opening up with the question of communities of faith and sort of the obligation to be the hands and the voice and the feet of moral action and conviction. And also Natalie's point about talking about intentionality. What Natalie just outlined, this American Jobs Plan and the larger package of $4 trillion, you know, it's often said that the federal budget is a moral document, right? When you're spending large volumes of money, you're going to change things and impact people's lives. That's not neutral. And it can be for good or ill. If you look at, you know, some of the wonderful things that have come out of past waves of investment, creating rural electrification, opening up infrastructure, creating a middle class, you also look at how these things have played out on the ground, whether it's the implementation of the New Deal or the GI Bill or the LBJ's Great Society, and who has voice and who's at the table when decisions are being made, when trillions of dollars are flowing into community. They need to flow into community in a way that touches the ground and touches people's lives, gives some level of democratic control and direction of where the projects go, that create wealth, that create empowerment. So this is a really fundamental piece of background as we think about the nature of a massive, transformative all-of-government investment plan. My background, I want to actually just talk a little bit. I love speaking to communities of faith. I come from a faith tradition. I grew up in a Quaker family, coming out of a peace tradition, and the notion of creative nonviolence, the idea that not doing bad stuff is not the same thing as affirmatively doing good things. And so, there's a Martin Luther King quote. It's easy to quote Martin Luther King, but it's worth saying, darkness doesn't drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hatred doesn't drive out hate, only love can do that. We are setting out to build a clean energy economy. That's not the same thing as pricing carbon, making it hard to pollute, setting limits on bad behavior. This is about investing in a resilient, empowered, clean, as Natalie was saying, 100% clean economy. This is about retooling the foundations, industrial policy, recreating supply chains, recreating access to wealth and opportunity. Going back, Dr. Brooks, Dr. Brent referenced that I wrote a book with Governor Inslee 12, 13 years ago called Apollo's Fire. We tried to lay out what it would be to do an investment sector by sector, community by community. Let's build wind, let's build retrofit homes, use weatherization to save consumers money on their power bills, to touch the infrastructure of community through block grants. And so when Governor Inslee jumped into the race, I joined his presidential campaign just to sort of say, let's run as a climate candidate, because the next president has to be a climate candidate or we will miss the boat. It needs to be a climate president. And we talked about a structure of standards, investment, and justice. And I just want to say a word or two about this. This is really different from cap and trade, where you price pollution, you let the macroeconomic price signals cascade down. Standards, investment, and justice. Let's set a goal of 100% clean energy by 2035. An investment package. Let's invest trillions of dollars in rebuilding infrastructure, homes, offices, cars, manufacturing. And then what Biden has carved out is 40% of this investment package needs to flow into justice. It still needs to be figured out how that's going to be implemented, but 40% of trillions of dollars is a lot of money going into frontline communities and rebuilding this infrastructure. So, as we get into more conversation, I hope we'll think about how communities of faith, communities of color, economic justice advocates, frontline communities can be at the forefront of directing those flows in ways that really touch people's lives beneficially. Just name a couple pieces of the plan that I think deserve special attention. There are drinking water revolving loan funds. So we have, Natalie mentioned it, no more Flint, Michigans, no more Newarks. Let's actually create jobs replacing lead sewer, lead water mains. Weatherization of homes. There's something called Hope for Homes. It's a consumer credit that goes right into people's pockets to replace their air conditioning and their windows, to cut their cooling and heating bills, especially low-income communities. This really goes to the bottom line of working families. There's something called a Climate Conservation Corps, building on the Civilian Conservation Corps. Let's put people back to work right now. Folks coming out of college, folks losing their jobs from COVID, let's get them into meaningful labor immediately on the public payroll. Other pieces that need attention, there's a green bank. The idea that financing backed by the federal government can actually crowd in money from community development, financial institutions, from pension funds like faith-based investors. There's a lot of institutional money that could be following these green investments and going to work retrofitting houses of worship. Just broadly, the electrification agenda to move off fossil fuels once and for all onto clean, 100% clean electricity. That's a built environment agenda. It's people wearing tool belts. It's real work in communities, small mom and pop businesses. One last point that I really want to say is, in this moment, there's a big discussion about bipartisan bills, getting coalitions together. How do we make this move? What goes into a clean energy standard or a renewable portfolio standard? How do we get this work? I'm hoping we can hang together as progressives around the cleanest, most robust, most job-creating package, get labor and environmental justice standing together for good jobs, and really stick to the president's vision of trillions of dollars of investment. We shouldn't be doing half measures. We're going to run a budget package. We're going to get one shot at it through this process called reconciliation. That package needs to be a climate bill. I'm worried we won't get another chance if we don't do it now. And that means progressives standing shoulder to shoulder, not breaking ranks, and fighting for the biggest bill to really get this work done. And I guess the very last point, and then I'll kick it back. My company, Urban Ingenuity, is also very involved in capital markets. If you're not involved in policy, if you control real estate or you're an investor, there is a need to move dollars through the market as well as through policy. As these plans hit the ground, we need to be ready to do the work. And that's going to take private capital and institutional investors, and faith-based institutions have a very important role in this. One of the things we do with Urban Ingenuity is to help faith organizations, affordable housers, nonprofit partners at the community level to look at how they can transform the assets they can control to create jobs and deploy clean energy today, even as we're starting to mobilize political will to get the even more transformative national policy agenda. So I'll kick it back over to you. Hopefully that was within the time you wanted for me, and look forward to talking more.
You're doing good. I'm about to make you a Reverend Doctor as well. Terrific. Thanks so much. And now we will turn things over to the Reverend Dr. Ambrose Carroll.
Here. I had to get in on that ordination. That was fantastic. Listen, I'm so excited to be here. All of the voices, Brother Brooks, glad again for your work, and thank you. I remember we met back in October of 2014. I think you were just kind of getting started and just excited about the breadth and depth of your work. Pastor Malcolm, hey man, my brother from another mother, always good to be on with you. Glad to meet you, Sister Natalie, and all of those on the line. Just excited to be here. You all are drawing a big circle. One of my favorite poems is by Edwin Markham. It says, he drew a circle that shut me out, a heretic, a rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win, and we drew a circle that took him in. Listen, we know how to do this in the United States of America. It is, no stretch. We know what needs to be done, and we need the courage to do it once again for the people and for the planet, and not just something that's done for here in this nation, but things that we do have global implications. And I think that we have for too long drawn too small of a circle. We know how to do it. The West was one, the Louisiana Purchase. Again, thanks to our brothers and sisters in Haiti that through a revolution and opened up the West, brought individuals in from Europe, gave them land. Come on, somebody say amen. Gave them land. Now they had to work it, they had to move it, but they drew a circle, but it wasn't a big enough circle because there were men and women coming out of slavery that were denied those pieces. There are Native American brothers and sisters who were trampled over. So our circle was too small, but we know how to do it. I'm from Oakland, California, and talk about people came west, and with the Roosevelts, we had the New Deal and the Square Deal, and we've had these conversations around power and how we grow our way out of things, and how those who are wealthy kind of remain that class of wealth, but labor and individuals who knew better and stood up and grew the Progressive Party and said, no, we have to draw bigger circles. And individuals were again, I'm from Oakland. I read a book a while ago called The Color of Law, I believe, and it talked about redlining. And they began to name off all of these names of these places that I've grown up in and places that I knew I couldn't drive fast in, sundown towns. We drew circles, people coming out of the war. People fought, came out of the war, was given housing, and the federal banks got behind them, and nobody said there's not enough money for development, right? That people were able to start lives and grow with a domestic product. You remember when that used to happen. But again, the circle was not drawn big enough. And people of color, Black people, indeed, were drawn out. And so we come to this place, how people say, Martin King said, we come to collect our check. We come to be a part. And even Martin King had to wrestle with this notion of Black power and kind of how that sounded. And it sounded kind of, nationalistic within a nation. It sounded like us first and nobody else. But the reality is it was just an acknowledgement that everybody else has power. But we've been drawn out of power. And so we said Black power. And then the Black church and the liberation theology and, the United Church of Christ always at the head of the spear, able to kind of handle that kind of language. And even King had to wrestle with it. And this whole notion of liberation theology. If you have not read Dr. Raphael Warnock's book on the divided mind of the Black church, you need to read it. It is a book for our nation, and it really puts things in perspective. And now we hear the call of Black Lives Matter, and the same notion kind of comes to mind. Is it elitist? Is it not recognizing that everybody's life matters? No, it's simply saying that in this nation, we understand that life matters. We understand that humans are respected, but Black life is not necessarily respected when individuals still getting bullets in the back of their heads. And so it is that same thing saying to the nation, it's time to draw bigger circles and bring everyone in. As we had the New Deal, and individuals and farmers were able to get subsidies, but Black farmers, I'm from Hollywood, Holly, Louisiana, down in the woods. And my grandparents in 1976 did not have running water in the house. And I used to say, we going to granddaddy's farm. I found it wasn't really a farm. He just lived in the country. Used to share crop though. And, but as we rounded the corner to come on the land, there was always an oil rig there, pumping oil out of the ground right next door. And yet my grandmama and granddaddy never had running water in the house. We know how to do it. We've just been drawing our circle small, and we've been doing it intentionally. And so just to continue that individuals recognize that, recognize our own history, recognize the history of our families. And again, for me, a lot of times growing up in the 70s, we look at this stuff as ancient history, but it's not ancient history. There are congregations who've had conversations about redlining and about allowing Black and brown peoples in the congregation. I'm talking about in the 1970s and the 80s. Come on, somebody. Y'all praying with me. So it's not ancient history. We have to have some conversations with parents and grandparents, and we have to have those hard conversations and come back and figure out how to draw bigger circles. Now, it's not all bad. And, living in the United States of America, even if you are poor, you can still go in a grocery store and eat to your heart's content. You just can't take it out. If you take it out, you steal it. But you can eat as many grapes as you want in the store. There's some places, most places on the globe, in the global South, people don't even have a store to steal from. And so we recognize that even as African Americans, as Black folk, that we are still a part of an elite society in the world who have been turning on switches and lights been coming on. We've been flushing toilets and water's been running. And so we recognize that and recognize even our own culpability within this movement. Before, in the 40s and 50s, Black folk came to Oakland, Detroit, Chicago. Or let me see, I think I'm giving y'all a Baptist 10 minutes. Let me slow down. Let me see if I can give you an Episcopalian 10 minutes and cut it a little short. But I heard somebody say we have good church in Oakland. Oakland's like a small Chicago. It's a good church town. But folks said people did not come to Oakland to go to church. They came to Oakland in the 40s and the 50s to work. They came to Oakland because Kaiser and that plantation were building ships, and they needed somebody to help in the shipyards. We came to work. We came to work in the Navy yards. We came to work in the canneries. And the reality is, after Ron Dellums and other things in the 80s, they closed the shipyard, started to close the canneries, fewer longshoremen jobs. And so it is drawing the circles that allow people to work. Talk about our urban centers where we used to have commerce. In Oakland on 7th Street, there's still Chinatown, but where Black folk used to do commerce, they put the BART station over and cut off our commerce. Again, we have to draw bigger circles. And as we're talking about this Green New Deal, and that's what I like to call it, because it brings in notions of theology. It brings in notions of care and concern, that we do it in a way that cares for the people, that we do it in a way that cares for the planet. He drew a circle that shut me out, heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had a wit to win, and we drew a circle that drew him in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will take the Baptist 10 minutes any day. That was terrific. Thanks for those remarks and those insights. We now have an opportunity to take some questions, and a question from the audience is probing this idea of expanding the circles. And how do we connect the grassroots to Biden's plan? What are some things we need to push for? What are some elements we need to be given a moral squint to further comments from any of our panelists on that question? Go ahead, Natalie.
Thanks for that. I would say overall, I mean, in terms of expanding the circle, this plan has to include everyone. This plan essentially affects everybody. It affects just every aspect of our economy. And so I think in terms of, you know, where to focus efforts, obviously focus the efforts of funding to the areas that have been neglected the longest, to areas and communities that have, you know, as you mentioned, Dr. Carroll, that, you know, your father, your parents' home, grandparents' home didn't have running water. But here it is, an oil well right next to it. And so it's showing that this whole idea, when we talk about development and progress and things like that, progress for who? Usually the people who are situated next to fossil fuel developments are usually people that are lower income, that are, you know, that are Black and brown communities, because they're facing the brunt of the pollution that we consider overall over the past century is progress. And so I think that we have to look at progress as being a little different in terms of progress is creating clean energy. Progress is building up an economy where we're getting the benefits of energy, but not having the negative externalities that are always facing the communities that are least able to fight back. And so actually having, for example, jobs, when we talk about a just transition off of fossil fuels, it's about expanding the circle so that people who are getting those clean energy jobs are first and foremost the communities that need it most, and making sure that it's not just going to a select area. In terms of expanding the circle of justice, understanding that, as I mentioned earlier with, you know, lead pipes, we've known lead pipes have been a problem in this country for decades. It's not that it's a new problem, it's an ignored problem. And yes, the, you know, crisis in Flint obviously brought more attention to it. But as we all know, there are many places in the country that have the exact same problems that are not going to get, nobody's going to even know about. And it's still something that we've just accepted as acceptable in our country, because it's okay if certain communities are being poisoned. It's okay if certain communities are being ignored. And so I think that what I want to see from this plan, and what I'm starting to see, is a plan that centers the fact that communities that have always been ignored, and as Dr. Carroll said, kept out of the circle, are the first ones prioritized in terms of funding, so that we can no longer just accept some communities being left out and essentially facing the brunt and damage of our fossil fuel economy.
Let me piggyback on that. I think it really bears repeating how historic the Biden plan is. We just saw a presidential cycle where suddenly climate for the first time was seriously on the agenda. I mean, he ran in his closing arguments, he was running TV commercials in Michigan and Arizona and Florida and Pennsylvania about climate and climate impacts. And his candidacy elevated 4 issues: public health, the economic crisis resulting from COVID, racial injustice and solutions to it, and the climate crisis and revolving it. And he brought those things together where the climate crisis became the vehicle for talking about a forward-looking, future-oriented investment agenda in people and places and a better economy, and sort of returning to that. I think Dr. Carroll said, you know, we know how to do this. This is a great American tradition, right? Roll up your sleeves, hope and optimism, rebuild, let's build railroads, let's actually get this done. You know, from Apollo going back, 15 years, we've been talking, there are, a consistent group. There's a movement that's been talking about an investment-led agenda. We never had an executive leader calling for this. So first of all, kudos that he ran on this, won on this, and actually put forward programs in the American Jobs Plan. Now is the challenge for organizers, right? You can't expect your leader to be your advocate, right? They're now governing and they got to make choices and they got to figure out how to thread the needle and get things passed. There's a need for an outside game to keep that level of ambition up and to continue reminding the House, the Senate, and the executive branch that they ran on this and they promised this, and it's wildly popular on a bipartisan basis. So maintaining ambition and courage is critically important. Just one other point that, redlining's gotten some good discussion today. Redlining is all about denying access to capital. It's about neglecting, it's about systematically disenfranchising certain communities, certain groups of people, certain geographies, so they don't have the money to participate in what wealth that is being created for others. So, all of these packages worked, but they just didn't work for the people who were systematically and intentionally shut out. So what we have to do now is make sure that doesn't happen. So Biden has put on the table this thing called Justice 40. 40% of these investments have to go first and foremost to frontline communities. That has to happen. Mapping where these dollars flow, mapping where the harms go, mapping where the infrastructure investments are made. Let's track it, let's screen it, let's hold people accountable. It's a great opportunity, but this is the moment when these deals are getting cut.
Listen, y'all got us buzzing around here. The chat's starting to light up, and I'm starting to see questions come in. I don't want to ignore either one of y'all, but this is one of my points of passion in talking about this jobs plan, especially when it comes down to communities of color, in particular Black communities, which have historically been robbed ever since they've gotten here. So it's not just about shutting off of capital, but also taking any gain that we've seen away. And we've seen 90% of the land that we've had as Black communities has been lost to us. And so we know that the dominant makeup of those who rent are Black people and Black communities. We are being punished as renters, as a society. Our system is set up so that renters aren't served. How do we form a national weatherization that also addresses those who rent, as well as how do we set up the supply chains within the community so that we really see the benefits? It's one thing to weatherize my home and me see the benefits from the utility bill. It's a whole nother thing for me to be able to see generational wealth being built, because we've got businesses and supply chain and distribution set up that we have access to and are managers and owners of, so that ultimately the community benefits and the wealth is cyclical instead of it leaving out of our communities. So if either one of you all want to speak to that, and that's going to be my only question, and then I'll pass it back to the audience for them to ask questions.
Amen. Powerful. If I can get it in, and I actually just want to add to your question. I don't know if I can answer it, but I just want to add to it. We often say that, the Black community may not own a lot of skyscrapers downtown, but we own a lot of church buildings and facilities. And a lot of, when I talk about the Black church, we recognize a lot of our Black churches are part of white denominations and larger pieces. But as a people group, there are a lot of congregational churches, Black churches in community. We done sold, potato pies, fried chicken. Grandma and them did more with less, right? They had note burning services. And we talk about what we don't have, but what we have together corporately are a lot of faith buildings. Because they are nonprofits though, right? Then you run into the issue of, because we talk about weatherizing public buildings, but we have to talk about, we're going to talk about wealth of Black people. We have to find a way politically and policy-wise to make sure that there can be some community benefit from bringing all of our church buildings operational, right? All of them have to be retrofitted. We just did Green the Church in St. Louis. We were leaving. It was October. They were getting ready for winter. Church did not have heat in St. Louis. Mom and them was going to have to come to church with their fur coats on. Come on, somebody. I know. Don't look at me like that. Yeah, they pulled out the fur coats because they don't have no heat. You see what I'm saying? And so we have to, if we can find a way to talk about that, because we're not going to run out of buildings in order to retrofit. And we have a workforce that we cannot just be customers and allow somebody else to come to those churches that grandmama and them built and say, now we're going to fix it up to you for free, but we're not the workforce. So that's something that I want to add to that as we think about homes, renters. How can we add these buildings that we have to the mix? Is that possible?
I've got a lot to say on this, but Natalie, if you want to jump in too, feel free.
No,
all right.
Any other question?
All right. So this is a buildings agenda. Buildings exist in places, they're close to, they're where people live, work, raise families, worship, gather. They're also, these are like most wealth for most people is held in any property that they own. And for institutions, solar energy in particular is distributed and community-based. A clean energy agenda that focuses on solar in communities, renewable energy, resilience, battery storage. These are assets very close to where we live and work, and they're assets that can actually lower costs for organizations like churches or affordable housing or nonprofit community centers. You can lower operating costs and you can also generate new income. And that's critically important. Most of the benefits of solar are passed through, though, through tax credits. And if you're a nonprofit, you can't monetize those. So there's a kind of an extractive industry, if you really look at it. A lot of bankers who kind of monetize these tax benefits, they take the tax credits. So you have these developers at the community level pulling together these rooftops, really doing hard work, get the job training program, get folks skill certified, aggregate the rooftops. But too often it's getting sold where too much of the benefit is flowing to already well-heeled financial interests. So one of the things Urban Ingenuity is doing, we're partnering with labor, environmental justice groups. We're creating a project called Working Power, where we're trying to create local ownership, where we're taking some of those tax benefits, monetizing them, but then taking direct community benefits, turning it into free power for low-income folks, direct ownership of the long-term cash flows that flow from these 20-year assets that throw off cash and income, or otherwise using the economics of clean energy to fund mission-based activity, whether it's a food bank or an emergency shelter, women's shelter, job training, financial literacy. These dollars can be put to work directly. And I love the statement that we have a workforce and we need to make sure that the small businesses, the women and Black and brown minority-owned businesses in communities need to be clearly in the front of the line. We know how to do this in local economic development. This is a new opportunity to apply that to a federal jobs plan. And that's what we have to do. Like progressive cities actually often do a reasonably good job with minority contractor programs, with job training programs. Let's take that leadership from the ground and let's scale it nationally. And community solar ownership is key to that.
I guess what I'm asking Bracken is, how do we safeguard? Because as Reverend Ambrose has told us, this has historically been done. There have just been some who've been left out. So as we saw with the New Deal, we saw that it happened, but Black folk got left out of the New Deal. We had the same old deal and we still got the same old deal. How do we access the Green New Deal infrastructure so that it benefits us economically, rebuilds wealth, generational wealth, as well as gives us those real solutions, not the false solutions, but the real solutions, and amplify the solutions that we already have in place so that we can scale those solutions. That's what I guess I'm driving at. The other thing, and I'm sorry, y'all, because this is just, again, my point of passion. The other thing is, as communities of faith, it's high time that we stop taking on the responsibility of the government and start calling for the government to do what they're responsible for. So even with the food pantries, even with weatherization, although we absolutely need to partake in that, We need access to those funds instead of those white interest groups coming into our communities and taking those funds out of our communities. We need access to those funds and to be able to build up infrastructures, even if the church workforce is the one that drives that. They need to be paid for what they do, and we need to quit trying to do it, need to quit being obligated to do it as charity. That's what I'm trying to drive at there.
Oh, I would say in relation to that, when I think about the original New Deal, it wasn't that it forgot people, it excluded them. So it wasn't like what happened, why didn't people get these resources? It's because the government did not want them to have it. It was a purposeful building up the wealth and the middle class for white Americans. So it did exactly what it was intended to do. I think the difference now in terms of, we talk about, if we're talking about the Green New Deal as a resolution, and also there's different bills related to the Green New Deal that have come out. Green New Deal for public housing, Green New Deal for essentially transportation, which is the Build Back Green Act and things like that. They're designed and created with the intention of it's not supposed to just be a let's build the white middle class. And so I think that now the intention for things that we're seeing, like legislation such as the different Green New Deal bills that have come out, that are actual bills, not resolutions. So there's funding attached to it, things like that, is that they're built with the intention of creating that infrastructure and opportunities in the areas that have always been ignored. And so I think that I don't even like when people bring up the original New Deal, I don't even like referencing it, because it's not a good example. It's an example of white supremacy, of how to build up white wealth in America, which was what it did. And so I'm happy for the things it brought us, right? Social Security, the original CCCs that we're still using as guides, as references for our current programs, which is fine, right? With the new CCCs, now it's Climate Conservation Corps rather than just Civilian Conservation Corps. But I don't think we should reference them at any other capacity than that in terms of what we're building for the future. And so in terms of how to make sure that the impacts are felt, it's more so, what is your intention? Like, I've had people ask me before about electric vehicles, right? So this particular, Biden's plan, he provides billions for electric vehicle charging stations, the infrastructure to make electric vehicles realistic, right? Because right now, has anyone ever seen an electric vehicle charging station, like a gas station? I have not personally driven past one before. So it's not as realistic. What about people who live in apartments versus a house with the 2 garages? Yeah, you can charge your electric car in your garage if you own a 4-bedroom house with 2 garages, but that's not realistic to everybody. So where do you put an electric car if you live in an apartment or you live in a place where that's not feasible? And so I think that in terms of, people have asked me, is that equitable? Is that something we should be investing billions in? Or is that just benefiting people that already have the wealth to access that? And I think the question is that the problem right now is that the only people who can get an electric car are those who have the wealth to access that, because they're usually more expensive, and who have the home infrastructure already set to accommodate that, which means that it's always going to be an exclusive elitist, essentially, venture to own an electric car. And so the whole point of changing the infrastructure is to match the needs of the people. Right now, everybody knows what's happening right now in the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic, right, with gas, right? Everyone knows what's happening, right? I had a text from a friend that said she lives in Georgia. She says they're out of premium gas, they're out of this, they're out of that. The fact that we are still relying on gas and shows our vulnerability, And so the fact is that I'm pretty sure many people would love the opportunity to not have to rely on a gas-powered car, but that's not feasible for most people. And so I think the plan that we're working towards is creating an economy, right, that obviously is off of fossil fuels, but that is accessible to everybody by making the infrastructure upgrades. And that's why we have to focus on infrastructure first. Otherwise, it's just hopes and dreams that people can make different market-based choices. And that's not realistic. We don't have a choice. There's so many communities that don't have access to proper grocery stores in different areas, usually lower income areas. That is an infrastructure decision by the government, essentially, of where they want needs to be met. And so that's why if we approach this properly with not the lens of how it was done in the past, but how we're going to do it, then we can create that clean energy economy that actually is for everyone.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Natalie. I kind of want to follow up on some of the themes that you addressed. You know, I think sometimes when we see a headline that says climate and jobs, we can get excited, but then when we look underneath and we see what's down below and we look at the details, it can play out in different ways. And one of the points that was made by in a piece that Kate Aronoff wrote is there's a real difference. She was arguing between the Green New Deal and the Biden plan. And what she was saying is that while there's a bunch of different components to the Biden plan, there are particular components that are very corporate friendly rather than people friendly or people centered. You know, and so you've got, you know, corporate tax credits for carbon capture mentioned, right? And so that's different than a Green New Deal where you're more directly investing in communities, right? And so I was just wondering, I mean, is that a fair assessment? Is that on target? Any thoughts on that?
It's definitely a fair assessment. I would say that, you know, in terms of like, you know, I mentioned my opening words is that there are parts of this plan that for myself as well as 350.org will not be pushing for. We do not want credits for carbon capture and sequestration. It's mainly essentially a ruse for companies to continue burning fossil fuels and to say that they have achieved this net zero, which is a made up term, in order to continue the burning of fossil fuels and saying, but it won't hurt people the same way anymore, which is a lie. Fossil fuels hurt people. That's it. The continued use of them hurts people. There is no, how do we put a buffer to make it less harmful? And so I think that, you know, I don't compare the Green New Deal resolution to this plan because I feel like they have somewhat different aims. The Green New Deal as a resolution was created in order to have a vision of success that we're aspiring to. And there's many ways to get to that success. There's many ways to get to where we need to be, but it was mainly created to inspire people to help build the world that they know is possible, because you can't really, you know, as the old saying, you can't achieve it unless you see it. Really, you have to see it to actually be able to achieve it. And so that's really what the Green New Deal resolution is about. In terms of the Biden plan of infrastructure, it's actually saying, where do we strategically put funds right now in order to improve the lives of as many people as possible, while also addressing the biggest threat to humanity, which is climate change. Now, my critiques of it is that it should not include nuclear. It should not include carbon capture and sequestration, because we already know those aren't actual solutions. We're not looking for simply energy that doesn't produce carbon dioxide. We're looking for energy that does not kill people. And nuclear energy is also dangerous as well. And so is uranium mining, which is communities that are faced with that are communities that are always faced with things like that. And I don't think anyone's going to volunteer to live next to your uranium mine. I just know you're not going to do it. So don't propose that this person does it, because that just shows that you don't actually care about that person if you think it's fit for them and their family, but it's not fit for you and yours. So be consistent. And that's why we're saying sustainable and safe energy is not the same as just clean. You have to have sustainable, safe, clean, and just energy. So in terms of the Green New Deal overall, don't look at the resolution as the same as legislation. It is a vision. It is not a bill. But the bills that have come out since then, Green New Deal for public housing, which is Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Sanders, Green New Deal, which is Build Green Act, which is Senator Warren and AOC. Those are actual pieces of legislation that have been introduced and or reintroduced this year that actually put billions of dollars behind building the infrastructure that we need to transition off of fossil fuels. And I actually am pushing to have, I would love to have those bills along with End Polluter Welfare Act, which ends fossil fuel subsidies, to actually be inserted into the Biden plan. That is actually what 350.org is calling for, is to have End Polluter Welfare Act, which ends fossil fuel subsidies. It's Representative Omar on the House, Senator Sanders on the Senate, and it would actually take that money, stop giving billions to fossil fuel companies so that we can actually start funding the transition instead of essentially funding our own destruction.
Thank you for that. You know, and we're at the UCC, we're following 350's lead on this one. When we wrap up in a couple of minutes, we're going to have some action alerts for those of you who want to stick around. We'll have 350's action alert on that for you to do, and we've also got another action alert, very similar. And Interfaith Power and Light also has a clergy sign-on letter. So we'll be presenting all those things in just a couple of minutes when we wrap up. And this has just been too good to contain in an hour, I feel like. But Michael, are there some comments, some thoughts that you want to add as we wrap this up and we move from thinking about it to acting on it?
Brooks, you know what? There's so much that's been said, and I'm ruminating on it and just reflecting even now and getting even more excited. You all have spoken to me today. In that, all that needs to be said has been said. Where do I sign? I think that's where we need to be right now as we move to this next phase and look at how we can support, how we can be active. We ought to go into this next part of our meeting saying, where do I sign? We should have been energized by what we heard. We should have seen where our points of compassion, our points of care are. We should have seen where we need to push as well as where we need to push back. We've heard all of the details in this conversation. There's nothing else to be said. Where do I sign? Thank you.
Thank you so much to each of our panelists today for being with us, giving of your time and your expertise and all the knowledge that you brought to us today. Normally, we follow this with Roberta Rominger, a Reverend pastor from the state of Washington. She got called away, some emergency circumstances, but everybody is invited to stay along after this webinar concludes to do those actions. I will put that in the chat box, a link that you can go to that collects those actions together. But grateful again to our panelists. Everyone who registered for this webinar will receive the link to the YouTube recording following this as soon as we get up and on the website. And so thank you to our audience for joining us. We wish we had time for all of those great questions that were raised. So take care, everyone, and be back next month as we come to you again with another program.